Start recording now. So let's begin. I I first, I know there's some of y'all that weren't with us last week, and so I kind of want to reiterate one point, and that is this isn't a traditional Bible study where we're going to kind of dig in depth with each chapter. As you know, this week we're looking at chapters 3 through 14, and so we're taking bigger chunks than usual. So I just want to kind of lift up that while we are doing this as a Bible study, we are studying the Bible, we're looking at it more thematically. We're trying to wrestle with our current situation of the pandemic, the struggling we're seeing around us, this widespread global struggling and suffering, to wrestle with that in the context of our faith through the tool of the book of Job, to see how Job kind of helps us wrestle with and maybe answer these questions. I say maybe because I think one of the things I want to lift up the most with Job is this is not a book of answers, but rather a book about asking questions. And so that's not to say that there aren't answers, but I don't think Job necessarily lifts up a specific answer. I kind of joked last week, if you read 3 commentaries on Job, you're going to get 3 different answers about what Job's about. That's probably true of everyone in this Zoom class and everyone watching at home, right? We all have our kind of understanding of what Job is about. And so what I want to lift up is the most important part of Job is that it prompts us to ask questions. And these questions can be extremely hard to ask sometimes. I'm sure some of us will sympathize with Job at some points, and some of us will sympathize with his friends at other points. The point being, though, is that faithfulness in Job looks like asking tough questions. And with that, we're going to kind of get into Job 3 through 14. So if you've looked at your syllabus at all, there's essentially kind of 3 sets of dialogue between Job and his friends, and this is the first one. And what happens is we enter with Job 3. And Job 3, if you've read Job before, it's not much of a surprise, but if you've only read Job once, you read the prologue, and Job is this upright and blameless person, and he seems to be just completely faithful in this kind of pious way. And then all of a sudden we get to Job 3, and he's yelling at God, he's cursing the day he's born, and we kind of are like, where did this come from? And so that's how we enter into the kind of poetic text of Job. So the prologue and the epilogue, which frame the book, are prose. Almost the entirety of the book is in poetry, though. And so with our reading today, we enter into that poetry. And it begins with this just, it's almost hard to hear at points because we hear Job one way and then he comes out another way. But what's happening there is Job is kind of setting the stage, and the remainder of this section is Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, replying to him. And as they reply, Job kind of replies back to them. So what I want to do right now is I want to read through some sections and then lift up just some overall thoughts I've had about it, about the text as a whole, and then we can open it up for discussion. If at any point you want to stop me, ask a question, do not feel like you need to wait towards the end. Wave your hand and Aaron and I will see you, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. I can't see all of you at once. There's 45 of us on here right now, so I have like 2 screens of you. So if you're waving and we don't answer, that just means we don't see you, so just unmute yourself. So I want to begin by reading chapter 3. I picked up a copy of Edward, I've got this funny background on it. It makes everything kind of invisible. Let me, hold on. I want to show you this because Edward Greenstein, who's studied Job for a very long time, came out in 2019 with a copy, a translation just of Job. He doesn't translate anything else. It's a commentary and translation of Job, and you can see it's Edward Greenstein. It's probably the most accurate translation we have of Job. There's beautiful translations. Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible is beautiful, and his translation of Job especially so. And I'm sure you have NIV or NRSV or NASB or whatever it is you like. But I would lift up, if you're looking for an accurate translation, this is a really good one. Now, it's kind of tedious in its notes, but some of you might be looking for that. Job is written to be taking place in a land far, far away, right? It's not in Israel. It's written by an Israelite, but it takes place kind of like in Transjordanian area, Edom. And one of the things that happens in the text is the author uses language outside of just biblical Hebrew, and so it's been notoriously hard to translate. One of the hardest books in the Old Testament. But anyhow, Greenstein's translation's a great one. So I'm going to read chapter 3. I know it's long, but I really think this is a vital part. This sets the stage for the entire book, and it's essentially what his friends are responding to. I'm going to read Greenstein's translation here, but don't, follow along with whatever you have. I just want you to hear some other reading of it. So this is after the silence of chapter 2, where Job's sitting with his friends. After that, Job opened up his mouth and cursed his day of birth. Up spoke Job, and he said, "Let the day disappear, the day I was born, and the night that announced a man's been conceived. As for that day, let it be darkness. May he not summon it, Eloah, from on high. May nothing luminous shine on it. Let darkness, dead darkness, expunge it. Let hovering clouds engulf it. Let daytime eclipses obscure it. As for that night, let pitch dark remove it. May it have no part in the days of the years. May it have no place in the court and the count of the months. Yes, as for that night, let it be sterile. May no joy take place on it. May they condemn it, the cursers of Yam, those armed with a curse for Leviathan. May the stars of the twilight turn back, that the night wait for the light, but there be none. Let it not see a glimmer of dawn. For it would not lock the doors of my womb and hide life's travails from my eyes. Why couldn't I die after leaving the womb, just go out of the loins and stop breathing? For what did knees have to receive me? For what were the breasts that I sucked? I could just have lain down in silence, slept and enjoyed my repose, together with kings and with counselors who build palace tombs for themselves, or with nobles, possessors of gold, who fill up their grave homes with silver. Why couldn't I be like a stillborn, just covered over in the sand like babies who never saw light? There in the grave, no more restless are the troubled, and there the failing of strength find repose. All prisoners are at peace. They hear not the voice of their oppressor. The small and the great, they are the same, and a slave is set free from his master. Why give light to one in travail, or life to those bitter of spirit, those waiting for death, but there is none, though they dig for it more than for treasure, those singing for joy at the mouth of the tomb, who are glad to be reaching the grave? Why give light to a man whose path is hidden from Eloah, who screens him off from his sight? For my moans come to me like bread, and my growls are doled out like my water. A fear I have feared, and it's come about. Just what I dreaded befell me. I've had no rest, I've had no quiet, I've had no repose. Restlessness comes. This is not easy to read in parts. It's extremely honest. It's shocking. I can't reiterate how different we get from the Job of verses 1 through 2 to this Job. And part of that is we haven't really heard Job speak at length, but here he speaks after this silence, and it is a silence questioning the meaning of life and basically saying that death is better. And so this sets the stage for these responses from Job's friends. And Aaron, I wonder if you would read for me in chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, and then 17 through 18.
17 through 18?
Yep.
Okay. I'm reading from the NIV version. Call if you will, but who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. I myself have seen a fool taking root, but suddenly his house was cursed. His children are far from safety, crushed in court without a defender. The hungry consume his harvest, taking it even from among thorns, and the thirsty pant after his wealth. For hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. Blessed is the man whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal.
Thanks. So this is Eliphaz, and Eliphaz begins the response from the friends, and Eliphaz is essentially saying Job is getting what he deserves. God punishes in a way that is just, and it is to kind of reprove people to make them better in the long run. And then if we go to chapter 8, I'm not going to get into Job's responses because I want to look at his friends, and then we'll come back to Job's response. So in chapter 8, if Bill Hull would read verses 1 through 10 of chapter 8.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Yeah, I just unmuted you.
Say the passage again, Will.
So, sure. So this is Bildad's response to Job, and this is in Job 8, verses 1 through 10.
Gotcha. This is from the New Revised Standard Version. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, how long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression. If you will seek God and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore to you your rightful place. Though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. For inquire now of bygone generations and consider what their ancestors have found. For we are but of yesterday, and we know nothing. For our days on earth are but a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and utter words out of their understanding?
Thanks, Bill. So again, one of Job's friends is responding. This is Bildad, and Bildad is taking this position essentially that God is right and just. And so all that God has done, supposedly, to Job is deserved. God would not act unjustly. So, and then we jump to Zophar in chapter 11. So this is the third of Job's friends, and the third response in this first dialogue section. So, Bonnie Givens, will you be our reader? And I'd love for you to read Job 11, verses 6 through 12.
Sure. And that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? It is higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measures is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he passes through and imprisons and calls to judgment, who can hinder him? For he knows worthless men. When he sees iniquity, he will not consider it. But a stupid man will get understanding when a wild ass's colt is born a man.
Thanks. So that is kind of following the lines of Eliphaz and Bildad. Zophar is essentially saying something a little bit different, and he's saying both that God is just and right, but also that God's wisdom is beyond our own. So you'll remember, I can never remember the exact chapter. It's in like Isaiah 55, I think, where it says God's ways are beyond our ways. His understanding is higher than our understanding. And that's essentially the position that Zophar is taking here. So that's what is happening here. Job has cursed the day he was born and essentially proclaimed that death is better than life. And his friends are responding. I want you to think about how they're responding, though, right? Job is speaking out of experience. He's speaking out of pain, and he's speaking out of suffering. They're speaking out of a theological tradition. So they're trying to explain that suffering. They're not trying to embody it in the way that Job is, or think of it in a kind of in a pastoral context. They're hearing what he's saying, and they're responding as if it's an argument, right? So there's dialogue happening, but it's much more the dialogue of debate or argument here. And so I want to look at how Job responds to them in a couple places. And the first is Job 7. So I'm just going to read a couple verses throughout Job 7. So I'll kind of lift up what I'm reading, but I'm going to start at the first verse. Do not human beings have a hard service on earth, and are not their days like the days of a laborer, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like laborers who look for their wages? So I'm allotted months of emptiness, and nights of misery are apportioned to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise? But the night is long, and I am full of tossing until dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens, then breaks out again. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to their end without hope. Remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. The eye that beholds me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall be gone. As the cloud fades and vanishes, so those who go down to Sheol do not come up. They return no more to their houses, nor do their places know them anymore. Job is not giving an argument here, right? He's speaking from what he's undergoing, and it's painful, it's suffering. At the very beginning in verses 1 and 2, he relates his kind of experience to all of humanity. So he's speaking from his personal experience, but he's saying other people experience this. This isn't just me alone. And then if you go to verse 17, what are human beings that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them, visit them every morning, test them every moment? So this is a riff on Psalm 8. What are human beings that you're mindful of them? But Job is kind of turning it over. He's upending it, and he's making it kind of like, why do you bother us, God? It's kind of a parody of Psalm 8. And in verse 20, it says, if I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of humanity? Why have you made me your target? Why have I become a burden to you? Why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I shall lie in the earth. You will seek me, but I shall not be. This part's so important, and I want to lift up why, because we often think of Job responding to his friends, and in many ways he is. But ultimately what's happening here is Job is responding to his friends, but I would say he's primarily responding to God. He's engaging with God, and he's saying, I can get into a theological debate with my friends, but ultimately it's this kind of existential cry on Job's part to God. And he's crying out to God and saying, God, where are you? And why is this going on? Why are you letting this happen to me? And I want to lift up this importance, because what's going on here is Job is praying. This might seem kind of strange, because we typically think of prayer as intercessory. We're asking God for something, or we're thanking God for something. It's praise or gratitude. This is a prayer of lament. It's a prayer of deep questioning. But what's happening here is Job is addressing God, and that's the important part. This isn't some atheistic cry, oh, there's no God. This is the exact opposite. This is, there is a God, part A. Part B is, why is this happening if there is a God, right? And so that's really important to think about. James Wharton, who's one of the commentaries I'm reading at this time, talks about this kind of deep, heartbroken prayer that occurs throughout this book. And the point being is, I want you to think about this as prayer, because Job is directing his dialogue towards God. And so I want you to think about, what does that mean for prayer in your thoughts? And how does that maybe upset what you think of prayer as? The Hebrew tradition has such a long history of lament, right? There's plenty of Psalms of lament. Like 131 or 88, these kind of cries out of the depth. There's the entire book of Lamentations. Jeremiah has plenty of laments. And so that is a deep part of the Hebrew and the Christian tradition, this prayer of lament. But it's one we're really unfamiliar with. And I think it makes us uncomfortable in a way. So I want you to think about that as you think about what Job is saying, why he's saying that, and what does that say about who he is in relationship to God? Because I want to make the point that this isn't Job questioning his relationship with God, but rather Job reaffirming his relationship with God and saying, where are you on your end, God? So another part I want to read is chapter 12. John Wells, would you read this for us?
Well,
So I want you to read, can you remember just to read 5, 13 through 14, and 23 through 24?
Will, could I make a comment just before we start?
Sure.
This is Dave Boyd. Kierkegaard at this point says that Job has lost patience with his friends.
Mm-hmm. Is that the end of your question? Oh,
Not a question, just a statement.
okay.
It's what happened with Job. He lost patience with his friends. He
Yeah.
protested to God.
Yep. I want to come back to that when we get to the question and answer part. That's a silly way to put it. The question part. I don't have any answers. But I think that's a really important thing to think about is I think Job's friends are just really, they're almost brash and very unpastoral in how they respond. I mean, there's parts where they say if your children were basically getting recompense for their sins. I think Bildad says that. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So John Wells, if you, I'm going to unmute you. And if you could read, we're going to look at chapter 12, verses 5, 13 through 14, and then 23 through 24.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, those at ease have contempt for misfortune, but it is ready for those whose feet are unstable. And then 13.
13 through 14, 23 through 24.
With God are wisdom and strength. He has counsel and understanding. If he tears down, no one can rebuild. If he shuts someone in, no one can open up. He makes nations great, then destroys them. He enlarges nations, then leads them away. He strips understanding from the leaders of the earth and makes them wander in pathless waste.
Thanks, John. So a couple of things is going on. Job is continuing to respond to his friends, and I lift up that verse 5 because I think this is important, and it kind of reiterates Dave's point. Those at ease have contempt for misfortune, but it is ready for those whose feet are unstable. So it's easy to think about and explain something when you're at ease. It's not when you're experiencing misfortune. And then Job in 13 and 14 seems to kind of reiterate the point of his friends, which is different because he's been kind of antagonistic to them up to this point. But he a kind of a test in verse 13, with God are wisdom and strength. He has counsel and understanding. And so we are like, oh, you can imagine his friends are like, oh, is he agreeing with us? Oh, good. Job's finally come around. He's agreed with us. But then he flips that on them. And if you go to verse 22, he uncovers the deep out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. He makes nations great, then destroys them. He enlarges nations and leads them away. So essentially, God's just kind of doing whatever God wants. 24, this is the one that would kind of stick like a knife into the friends. He strips understanding from the leaders of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless waste. So Job has kind of pulled his friends in saying, you know, God is wise, but he flips it on him and says it's a wisdom that makes no sense to us. And it leaves you people that think you're smart and wise in the dark. And then if you go to verse 13, this is where Job kind of is hammering his friends again. Verse 4, as for you, you whitewash with lies. All of you are worthless physicians. If you would only keep silent, that would be your wisdom. Hear now my reasoning and listen to the pleading of my lips. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitly for him? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? So he's basically saying, you're trying to speak on God's behalf, but you're just speaking nonsense. And so Job has not relented in any way to his friends. And if anything, he's calling them out. He's saying, y'all are full of it. And he's saying that in a very blunt way. And then verse 7, I want to just read again, because I think this is kind of the crux of Job's argument. Will you speak falsely for God and speak deceitfully for him? And so Job is just kind of responding to his friends in a way at first that's saying, I'm speaking from experience, not from kind of an abstract theological position, to, yes, maybe God is wise, but it's not the wisdom you think. The other thing that's going on through here is throughout this section, Job is essentially wanting to take God to court. And he says, I want to take God to court. That seems preposterous, but then he says, well, maybe I should do it. And then he says, maybe I shouldn't. And then he imagines what it would be like to take God to court. And then at the end, he kind of relents and say it would be pointless. So Job is engaging with both his friends and with God in these kind of different arguments, as well as just giving this existential cry. I want to open it up for questions in a second, but I want to point out some things that came to me as I was reading through this. The first thing I noticed was just the sheer beauty and poetry of this section. You can't but be taken aback by just how beautiful the writing is. Even the parts that are really hard to read are just written in such a beautiful way. The second is the philosophical depth. Regardless if we agree with Job's friends or not, these are all kind of responses we have heard to the meaning of life, to suffering, to the pain of others. And so Job is seriously, the book of Job is seriously wrestling with these things. Another thing is the relatability of the perspectives. I think we can all say we've been in each one of these folks' shoes at some point in our life. Sometimes we're Job, sometimes we're Job's friends, but at some point in our life, we have probably thought through, that doesn't mean we necessarily agreed with, but thought through these different scenarios. And so Job is, that's like we talked about in the first class, it is a story, and as a story, it kind of serves as a place that we can enter and think through all of these different things. I want to remind us that Job is three-dimensional. So often we can just say Job is pious, Job is not pious. But I think the point to remember is that Job is a human just like us, and he's both pious and impious. And so as we go through this, you can't just think of Job as this kind of static character. Job changes throughout this book, and I am seeing more and more that book of Job is a spiritual experience that we are witnessing. And that means that Job is questioning, asking, and moving throughout. His faith is consistent, but his faith is changing in a way. This is probably the most important point, and I think one of the most forgotten points. The prologue begins with this conversation between God and the accuser. And for y'all that didn't join last week, it's translated as Satan, but it's not the Satan that we think of in the New Testament. It's just simply someone that's on God's heavenly court that's known as the accuser. It's kind of an antagonist. And so this is the part to remember. We know something Job and his friends don't know. If you have your Bible in front of you, go to Job 1, verse 8. Then the Lord said to Satan, to the accuser, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And then go to Job 2:3. Chapter 2, verse 3. The Lord said to Satan, the accuser, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. God's self claims that Job is blameless and upright. So we know something that his friends don't. His friends assume that he has sinned in some form or fashion, is being punished for it. As we as readers know, he hasn't sinned. He is upright and blameless. That comes from the mouth of God. And so that's something to think about as you're reading this, because there's two stories going on. There's the immediate story of Job and his friends and their knowledge of what's going on. Job knows he's blameless and he doesn't know why these things are happening. Job's friends assume something has happened for him to do this. Then there's the larger story of the reader who knows God claims Job to be upright and blameless. And some kind of wager has been made between God and the accuser. So I'm really interested to hear how y'all think about how that kind of divergence of what Job and his friends know versus what we as readers know, and how that affects interpreting this story. The other theme that I think kind of comes through here is experience versus explanation. If you are going through pain, you're taking that, you're seeing that through the eye of experience. If you aren't going through pain, you seek out explanation. You try to make sense of it. And I think what Job is kind of pushing us towards is to move simply beyond explanation, to confront God, right? And that's what Job's doing. Job's friends are trying to explain, and Job is in the depths of experience, in the depths of suffering, trying to make sense of it in a way that expands beyond abstract theological explanation. A related point to that is this pushes us as readers beyond simple theological explanation. And so in the context of COVID and the pandemic going on, it's one thing to kind of throw out, this is happening because X, Y, or Z. It's another to think through, what are these folks that are in the hospitals, these people that are in the ICU, what are they experiencing? What are they going through? Not trying to explain why it's happening, but rather to kind of sympathize, or if we can, empathize with them. And then one thing I'm thinking about that kind of sets the stage for the whole book is, what happens in those 7 days of silence? What's going on in those 7 days of silence where Job moves from silence and just kind of explaining away what's happened to him to this existential, I heard one commentator call it a primal scream, to this deep, deep cry from the depths. So that's enough from me. I want to open it up to questions. Wave your hands or just unmute yourself. And if you have questions about a specific part of the text, that's fine. Or if you just have a broad reflection or question, that's fine as well. With that, I'll turn it over to y'all. I hear someone. Nope.
And just a reminder, if you're on the phone, hit *6 to unmute.
Will, I had a kind of a thought when I was reading it. This is Jeff Reynolds. Has there been any kind of commentary or anyone who's really gone in and analyzed the different aspects of the different friends in how they're commenting? You know, it's always a similar, and you talk about how it's kind of pastoral and they're speaking theologically, but they all seem to be coming a little bit from a different perspective as well. So they each kind of have their, well, it's you know, he does this and you just can't ever understand him, or it's more of a, well, he does this, but it's because we deserve it. You know, something like that. Has there been much that you've read kind of looking at those different perspectives?
Yeah, so their perspectives, I would say, are kind of similar and kind of different. The best way to describe it is they're responding from this tradition of wisdom, and in the ancient Near East context in which the Bible was written, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the idea of wisdom is that those who are most wise are those who fear God, and fear God in that sense is kind of like a deep respect, awe, admiration. And so for them, there's this whole kind of lineage of tradition. So you can think of like Proverbs and Psalms, Job. These are books of wisdom, right? They speak about what makes a person upright or just or moral or righteous. And so they're all kind of speaking from that by and large. I would say there is a little bit of difference between them, and that'll kind of get expounded more as we read the other dialogue cycles. But I would say that Eliphaz is saying that Job is getting what he deserves, that God uses punishment in some way to correct our behavior. So this is like the traditional explanation of evil, that God is a parent and we are the children, and God is, gently pushing us towards better behavior. Bildad simply makes this exclamation and kind of an illegal point that God is right and just. And it's just kind of, that's it. And then Zophar lifts up this, God's wisdom is beyond our own. Don't even try to understand it. It's beyond our understanding. And so commentators have pointed out the differences between them. And there are differences. I just would say that they're kind of all coming from a similar perspective in the larger picture. Thanks.
I keep going back to the accuser because I just have so much trouble wrapping my head around the fact that we pray to God and say, I try to be a good person. I try to do the best I can. And the thought of God turning loose all these terrible things on a blameless man is just hard to rationalize with the God that I love. And I assume that probably a million biblical scholars have written about it, but it's still hard for me to grasp. Can you help with that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can help with that. So that's a great point, and I think that's part of the point of the text, right? And I can't lift up enough that this is a story. This is not a historical happening, and as it is a story, we are to enter into it in that way. And it's essentially allowing the community that read Job originally and the person that wrote Job, it's saying there's evil in this world and it doesn't make sense. We're going to try to wrestle with why that's going on. And so one of the ways they do that is to say God and the accuser make a bet. I don't think we as readers are ever to become comfortable with that, right? That should bug us to the very end, that God would just make this kind of happenstance wager with the accuser and say, do whatever you want, just don't kill him. I mean, Job loses his entire family, not to mention all of his wealth. And he gets, this nasty illness covered with sores. And so I think if you can think of it in one way, maybe think of that as an articulation of the despair humanity faces in points of time. And the other thing I would say is, while we are wrestling with that, Job and Job's friends are wrestling with it from the perspective of they don't even know that's happened. And they don't know that Job is upright and just. And so what I think that does for us as readers is it reminds us we do not always have the full story. And so don't go around making accusations of so-and-so deserved this, right? So-and-so, it's like when Jesus is asked, why is this man blind? Did his parents sin? And Jesus says, that's not what the point is, right? So there's always something more to the story than we can see. I don't know if that helps, but I want to say that angst you have, maybe even that anger you have around that is good, right? Because this book is about the suffering of innocence, of the innocent in some form or fashion. And so there should be a kind of anger or a question about it. If we simply just throw our hands up and say, oh, they're not innocent, they're suffering for some reason, we're no better than Job's friends, right? We're just kind of seeking an easy way out. And what Job is doing is really, really driving into these harder questions.
Will, this is Martin Miller.
Hey, Martin.
If I could reflect on that, I agree with you about it's a story and it's designed for us to look at. And it also points out there are different plot lines in the story of Job, but it also points out that Job's friends are sort of like us. If we can blame something, it makes us feel better. So that's what they're trying to do. And we did that with the pandemic, or it was done. Well, we blame the Chinese to start with, and then it just keeps changing. So it's ridiculous to try and do it. And so it sort of reflects what the book of Job is talking about. It's kind of ridiculous to try and tell Job with these other people, here's why this is happening to you. And they haven't got a clue, really. But it would make them feel better if they think it's that way. So what might you reflect on that? Is that something that makes some sense?
Yeah, I think you relating Job's friends to us is a really poignant thing to say, because I always say when we read the Gospels, we always laugh at the disciples, but in reality, we are the disciples. We're bumbling around, we're misunderstanding Jesus, we think we're following him and we're not, right? And I would say in Job, a lot of times we think of his friends as kind of inconsiderate and as silly, but in reality, we oftentimes are Job's friends, and that's important to remember, because oftentimes when we are confronted with suffering, instead of sitting in silence with it or praying over the person or trying to sympathize with the person, we try to make sense of it, and oftentimes all that does is cause more damage.
I was thinking about the questions you had at the end of this one, and looking at historically, I guess I was thinking more of Abraham and Isaac and then Jacob, and thinking how neither Abraham or Isaac questioned God's actions. I mean, obviously Isaac was on the place to be sacrificed, and he's not fighting him. It doesn't show us. So here is this period of sacrifice, but then when Jacob comes along, he wrestles with God. He's thinking about this. And so your question was early in that list, was he right to question God here? And I think already there's a feeling that if you're going to continue a good relationship with God or strengthen it, then you're going to say, what is going on here? I mean, I just feel like that.
Thanks, Sherry. I think that's a great point, and kind of what I've been saying at the beginning of class, that faith in Job looks like questioning and asking questions. Job's friends think they're right and assuming that Job is sinned in some form or fashion. We know from the prologue that God himself considers Job upright and blameless. And so if anyone is right, it's Job. He might not be, hitting it on the head each time, but he's driving in the right direction, and that's questioning God. And I think, excuse me, I think it's really important to say this. It's not just questioning for the sake of questioning. It's questioning that's coming from a place of deep concern. And so it's not just this kind of abstract philosophical questioning. It's a questioning that's coming from experience, from suffering, that's genuine and honest.
Okay.
I have a comment. I guess for me, I found it helpful that Job is angry. He's not afraid to call out to God and say, why was I ever born? This is just, I'd rather just die and cover me with dirt. I mean, I think that shows the real communication, that we don't just go to God with prayer requests, but we can be mad, we can be angry, we can be just letting our pain out. And then another thing, you said those 10 days of quiet. I imagine that Job was just suffering and crying and saying, why me, why me? But I know from my experience, I so often will cry out, but I don't listen. And I'm just wondering if it's a question to us. It's okay to communicating with God, just be blunt, be honest. But then we have to have that ability to sit back and try to listen.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. That's that's the whole point of Job, right? That this is a dialogue. It's not only a dialogue between Job and his friends, but God eventually speaks towards the end of the book. And so there is this kind of listening for God at the beginning, and perhaps Job didn't hear God, and that's where the blunt, honest cry comes from. But ultimately, God speaks, and Job has to respond to that. And so I think that's a great point, is to think about prayer is not just gratitude and intercessory prayer. It's also crying out from lament, but it's also listening, and that entails kind of opening oneself to God. Thanks.
One thing that really struck me, or something I think I try to do while reading this, that I don't know if I've done this in historical readings of this, is trying to keep in mind the perspective of the characters at the time. And where it really struck me is in chapter 9, when Job says, if only there were someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both. And for me, that's Jesus. And so for us now as Christians, we have an arbitrator. We have Jesus. Not that we can't question, and not that we can't, continue to say, why do bad things happen? But, I think my perspective is a little bit different, having the knowledge we have of the New Testament versus at the time, the characters here, they didn't have Jesus. They didn't have this arbitrator. And so I don't know if you've thought through, if that's something that, you've kind of talked about with any of your other theological folks.
Yeah, that's that mediator is such an important part of this, and especially in the context of this legal discussion that's happening from kind of verses 8 onward. It's saying, do I have a mediator in this sense? And I think you bring up Jesus is such a great point, because Jesus is that mediator, right? That the God man, the one that stands with one foot in humanity and one foot in divinity, so to speak, and as the fullest revelation we have of God. And that's, I think, I'm trying to think who asked last week. I think it was maybe Terry, but Terry asked, do we read this as Job is a kind of prefiguring of Jesus, as Jesus? How do we do that? And I've always said we have to read this book as kind of in two ways, right? We read it as a book that was written before Christ and before knowledge of Christ. And so we read it in that context, but we also read it in the context of our Christian faith. And so we think through, how does this apply to Jesus and stuff? So yeah, I think you're right on with the mediator part. The other thing I would add to that is in John, before Jesus leaves, he speaks to the disciples of the Paraclete, and that's the advisor or the mediator. And so another way to think about that is maybe the Holy Spirit as a mediator. Who else has a question or verse or section? Oh, Marcia.
And Bill does as well. So I just unmuted him.
I'll wait.
All right, Marcia, why don't you go first?
I was doing a little bit of research on how were the three different. Somebody asked that earlier. One of the things they were saying, that there are pretty much coming from a similar place, but their personalities. Eliphaz, at least in this first round, started out almost respectful. Bildad is looking more for, he's kind of, well, let me tell you, I'm smarter than you are. And then Zophar comes in and he's absolutely in his face. That's the one about your kids probably are getting worn out. But the way I've kind of come to this is that a lot of religion is looking for tautology. God is good. He rewards the just. He punishes the evil. You're getting punished. That's point one of the tautology. Point two is you're getting punished. Therefore, you're evil, or you've done evil. And I think that's what the friends are saying. And that's an easy religion. We've got these tautologies. We can understand it. It's all packaged up. Here's the bow. And what Job is showing is this is about a relationship. and relationships go through good times, and sometimes relationships get sticky. But he is staying with the relationship with God, trying to work through it, and you come back to the kind of harmony that they had had previously, probably being wiser for having had that difficult dialogue. Tautology relationship.
That's a great point, Marcia. Is the personalities of the friend also relate to their kind of presentation of the wisdom, but also that idea of Job is pushing us to privilege relationship with God over and against empty religion. And I can't think of a better way to kind of sum up Job's relationship to God versus Job's friend's relationship to God. From a superficial reading, Job almost seems problematic or impious, but a deeper, you see that he has a genuine, deep relationship with God. And on a superficial reading of his friends, it seems like, well, they're, good religious people, but when you dig down into it, it's kind of empty and superficial, and they're not being compassionate towards their friend. They're just privileging kind of the religious, use the word tautologies of the day. Thanks. Bill Hull.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for asking us to read this in the light of our current crisis. It stirred so much in me, and I'll limit myself to one thing briefly. Years ago, I came across a quote attributed to St. Augustine, and I printed it out. In every Bible I have, I put this in the front of it. Oh, let thy scriptures be my pure delight. Let me not be deceived in them, neither let me deceive by them. And for me, this book of Job and this study is a reminder of how we can deceive ourselves and others with our theology. And one of the thoughts that came to me this morning listening to this, in this story, there's a catastrophe. Job honestly reflects his anguish, and the friend's first question is, in effect, who's to blame? Some weeks ago, following the lectionary, we studied the story of the blind man. The reverse, he is healed. And what's the first question that's put? Who sinned, this man or his parents? I think what a picture of how we deal with tragedy and good fortune. We rush to this. There's got to be somebody to blame, or on the other hand, to give credit to. And to me, pastorally, the most poignant verse in this is where it says of the friends, they saw that his suffering was very great. And what follows that, we saw today, is Job illustrating how great his suffering was. And the friend's question is, who's to blame? And I think it was Martin earlier said, that's what we're doing in this crisis. Now, I am looking forward to a clear-eyed, dry-eyed analysis of how we might learn from this and what we might do differently. But all this blaming, it seems to me, is pointless. But this illustrates that's human nature. We rush to blame.
Yeah, I think you're right on there, and I think that's kind of shown over and over again throughout the friends. If you go to, if you've got your Bibles in front of you, look at verse 5-4. So this is Eliphaz speaking to Job, and he's talking about the foolish, and he says their children are far from safety, they are crushed in the gate, there is no one to deliver them. So he's speaking about the fools, but this is his friend who just lost all of his children. And then go to chapter 8, verse 4, and this is Bildad, and Bildad's even more on the nose. He says, if your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the power of their transgression.
Mm-hmm.
Who would ever say that to their friend who just lost their children, right? But that's kind of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to read. I always tell folks, when you read scripture, read it as if you're reading it for the very first time. These stories are so ingrained, not only in our family systems and our church systems and our culture, and so we get a familiarity with them, and they lose their kind of shockingness or their humor or their beauty. And so when you're reading through this, read it and really think through what's going on and what are these characters going through, because you could just read that as, well, they're just saying something, but that's a very biting, hard thing to read and to think of a friend saying to another friend. Thanks, Bill. So we've got just a few minutes left. Was there anything else from this Oh,
Sorry, Mary Beth had her hand raised.
oh, okay. Mary Beth?
Hey,
Hello.
this reminds me of well-meaning people who go to someone who has experienced a huge loss or just something awful, and they are trying to help, and they say everything happens for a reason. And that just, to me, is heartbreaking, because it leads the suffering person to question, what is the reason? And they begin to think that they have done something wrong, or that they haven't had enough faith. I think people mean well when they say something like that, but I think it is hurtful instead of helpful.
Yes, I completely agree. I think people use, it's become so cliche. I can't remember where I was yet. I think it was at the barber shop. And the woman who cuts my hair, I was saying something that happened that was pretty bad. And she goes, oh, well, I believe everything happens for a reason. And I just stopped in I didn't say anything to her, but I just thought, that can be such a terrible thing to say, but it's become so cliche, it's used pretty widely. But if you really think about, does everything really happen for a reason? It's one thing to say, well, I didn't get the parking spot I wanted. It's another to say, look at all the death that's happening from the pandemic. The reality of how contagious this is, and people passing each other and getting it for no reason at all. I just think, yes, this speaks against that bad theology of everything happens for a reason. Now, I want to speak, that doesn't say that God is not involved, that God isn't involved in human history and human happenings, but I think that there's a superficialness to everything happens for a reason that is more like Job's friends, that's not digging in and dealing with the harder questions. So thank you, Mary Beth. And I saw Debbie. Where are you, Debbie? Okay,
Hello.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I read this for the first time, and every single sentence I related to what's going on now, what's happening now in our pandemic, and how people are reacting. And one of the things that really just stuck out in my mind and my thoughts were, as I'm reading this, I'm relating everything to what's going on now, the people saying this, the people saying that, the controversy, the anger, the resentment. And then I got to chapter 13. If only you would all be together silent. And I thought about this for actually a couple days, because as I was silent and stopped listening and stopped paying attention to all this and all the craziness that's going on, I saw in a different way of what's going on. I saw the people getting fed. I saw the organizations coming together. Even this class coming together. I've never been able to come to this class because of the timing, and I'm blessed. I'm blessed. I see things in a different light, I guess you'd say, by reading this and by reading all the fact that this is in the Bible, that there were other people in other times going through the same exact, I mean, not the same, but the same. There was suffering, there was death, there was murders, there was killings, there was famine. But through that, what are we seeing? We're seeing people opening up, being more caring, being more understanding, maybe, gathering their thoughts together and thinking of this as a different view. Parents are looking at children differently now, and teachers, and your servers, your grocery store people. It's just, like I said, it's a way that I'm looking at things differently just by being silent and not questioning, just understanding that this is part of life. We're going through this. We're all going through this. We're all going through it together. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. That's a great way to end this section, to think about the power of silence, and instead of getting caught up in the anxiety and the kind of cross noise, to just stop and look, as Fred Rogers would say, to look for the helpers, to look at all the good that's being done amidst the tragedy. And I think that's a wonderful way to end this. Friends, thank you all so much for joining. And as always, I would advise you to go through your notes when you get a chance throughout the week, because I put a ton of information in there and a lot of questions that we don't get to in the class. We will be looking at chapter 15 through, I'm looking at my syllabus, 15 through 21, which is the second dialogue cycle for next section. Let me say a quick prayer and then we can go our ways. And thanks again for joining. Gracious and holy God, I give you thanks for the community of Palmacia and those who are new to Palmacia who join us now. We give you thanks for fellowship in a time of social distancing, for the ability to see each other's faces, to hear each other's voices, even though we cannot be together. We give you thanks for your scriptures, and particularly for the book of Job, and the way it challenges us, the way it confronts us, not to give in to easy theologies or explanations, but to seek sympathy and empathy with those who suffer, with those who are undergoing pain, to ask the hard questions, but through that to be drawn in deeper relationship with you. Lord, keep us from easy answers, keep us from dismissal or from the busyness of empty talk, and let us be helpers. Let us be folks that pray. Let us be people that ask questions. For we ask this all in your Son, our Savior's name. Amen. Thank y'all. If you have any questions, email me. If you have any Job art, email me and I'll share it with everyone. Take care. Not personal Job art unless it's really good.